Mr. McCabe? Mr. McCabe? Mr. McCabe?
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes,
Hello?
you with us?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, I apologize for not. Anytime you feel like you need a break, you just let me know. I apologize. It's been over 2 hours, and I apologize for not remembering that. So, Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to associate myself with the comments made by my colleague, Senator Durbin, and others on the Democratic side on why we are here for the fourth time to go over ground already covered, particularly by Inspector General Horowitz' 434-page report. And the witness was asked questions about text messages between Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, when it is clear that they did not impact the validity of the Russia investigation. And yet, when we have real facts about national security concerns, such as President Trump calling the president of Ukraine to shake him down to help his re-election campaign, my Republican colleagues don't think that's a big deal. Now, I can understand why President Trump wanted to get dirt on his potential political opponent, especially as Joe Biden, in fact, defeated President Trump decisively, a fact that many of my Republican colleagues have yet to be able to acknowledge. And so we are here for the fourth time for many more hours of hearings on grounds that we've already covered, instead of dealing with the real questions of the day. So for this witness, you were asked by Senator Blumenthal about the recognized danger of white supremacists, and I just want to reiterate, because I think it is very important for our country to understand the dangers posed by these persons. So in September 2020, FBI Director Wray warned that white supremacy is one of the biggest domestic terrorism threats. News reports around the same time also indicated that the Department of Homeland Security had reached a similar conclusion, that white supremacists are the deadliest domestic terror threat facing the country. I'd like to ask you again, given your extensive experience in counterterrorism issues, do you believe that the threat posed by white supremacists is a serious concern?
Well, Senator, I know that it is a serious concern, and I certainly take Director Wray's assessment that it is the most serious concern on the counterterrorism side that we face right now. It makes a lot of sense in light of the fact that as our foreign terrorist targets appear to be in a state of less organization, and their operational activity and recruitment in this country seems to have tailed off a bit. I don't have any access to the classified information, but certainly seems that way. There's no question in that the domestic terrorist scene has not tailed off. If anything, it has increased over the last few years.
And you indicated that the kind of words used by the president simply seems to fan those flames of domestic terrorism activities.
That's correct.
I believe you
That's correct.
responded that way.
Yes.
Before the election, President Trump and Attorney General Bill Barr repeatedly made false claims of mail-in voter fraud. In September 2020, FBI Director Wray testified before the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee that, and quote, "We have not seen historically any kind of coordinated national voter fraud effort in a major election, whether it's by mail or otherwise. Now that millions of Americans have voted without evidence of fraud, President Trump and the Republicans have refused to recognize the results of the election. And instead, they have gone to court many times at this point, losing pretty much I think they've lost every single one of these voter fraud cases, to prevent validly cast votes from being counted. And President Trump continues to falsely claim that he has won the election with absolutely no evidence. Given your extensive experience at the FBI, are you aware of any evidence indicating that widespread mail-in voter fraud is a problem in our country?
I'm not aware of any information to that effect. Director Wray's assessment is consistent with my own experience in the FBI that I've never seen information that would substantiate a widespread effort at voter fraud.
And while my Republican colleagues are very busy talking about how the president has a right to go to court, that still puts a burden proving that there is actual fraud on him. And so far, he's been losing at every turn. So just because one has a right to go to court does not make it right to go to court. And one would hope that the president would have figured that out by now, but apparently not. When you mentioned in your opening that it was an honor and a privilege to work for the FBI, there are concerns for many of us about the politicizing of the FBI and DOJ. And since taking office, President Trump has repeatedly called on the Justice Department, i.e. at as many rallies where they chant, lock her up or lock him up or whatever it is, to investigate his political opponents, and leaned on Attorney General Barr to treat his allies more favorably. For example, under Attorney General Barr, the Justice Department reversed the sentencing recommendation for Trump ally Roger Stone, prompting all 4 career prosecutors to withdraw from the case and protest. You have served for 21 years at the FBI. In your memory, before President Trump, how many times has a president called for the investigation or arrest of political opponents to aid him in his re-election campaign?
I've never, not in my experience, I've never seen that before.
In June 2022, Justice Department career lawyers testified. They actually testified before the House about how Trump political appointees intervened in criminal and antitrust cases to advance the personal interests of President Trump. What do you think it says about the severity of the politicizing of the Justice Department that 2 career DOJ lawyers came forward to testify about it before Congress, and all 4 career prosecutors made the extraordinary move of withdrawing from the Roger Stone case?
As I've said, Senator, career prosecutors don't walk away from cases that they believe in and cases that they've spent a lot of time and effort trying to move forward. So when you have any member of the Department of Justice who feels compelled to resign from a case or from the department for ethical reasons, that's a very concerning thing. When you have 4 on one case resign, I think it's the sort of thing that we can't possibly ignore.
Is quite extraordinary. And I would like at this point to commend all of the career DOJ people, including, of course, all the people at the FBI, for doing the jobs that they're supposed to be doing and not making political decisions. Now, we know that hate crimes against the AAPI community has gone up, and especially with the president calling the virus the China virus, the Wuhan virus, and members of his administration have also referred to it as Kung flu. So there has been documented increase in hate crimes against AAPI communities. Given your extensive experience at the FBI, do you think the FBI and Justice Department are doing enough to address hate crimes in our country, including against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders? And do you know of any prosecution by the DOJ on any of these hate crimes?
I'm not aware of recent prosecutions of hate crimes. Again, I don't have access to all of the information that the FBI or DOJ has, and so I can't speak to whether they're doing that work or not. It certainly seems that those sort of incidents, just from what I hear in open source reporting, seem to be on the rise, and I would expect that the Bureau and DOJ should be looking at those things very closely.
I should hope so, because so far I don't know of any indictments coming down on these kinds of cases. I believe my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. McCabe.
Thank you very much, Senator. I think we have Senator Hawley on the line, but I got just a real brief inquiry here. Mr. McCabe, what is a defensive briefing?
A defensive briefing is typically when we reach out to an individual who we think might be the subject of some sort of malign activity from a foreign government or a foreign power, and try to make them aware of the threats that they might come across.
An example would be, I think Senator Feinstein had a staff member that was suspected of being connected to the Chinese intelligence community, and she was briefed about that. Is that correct? Would that be an example?
That sounds like the sort of information or a sort of situation in which we would give a defense knowledge.
And she took corrective action by dismissing that person. Was there ever a defensive briefing given to Hillary Clinton about concerns about her campaign being reached out to or interfered regarding foreign actors?
I'm not sure, Senator. I saw some of the documents on the committee's website seem to indicate that, but I don't have an independent recollection of that briefing.
Well, I can just assure you that she was. There was a suspicion that a foreign government may have been trying to aid her campaign. She was briefed about it. Counterintelligence investigations are designed to protect entities from foreign influence. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Counterintelligence investigations are designed to protect American interests against foreign influence. Is that correct?
That's right. Counterintelligence investigations are designed to mitigate threats to national security.
So like Senator Feinstein could fire somebody that was on her staff to mitigate it. Is that a good example?
That could certainly be one way to mitigate a threat.
At any time during the multiple counterintelligence investigations that were conducted against Trump campaign officials, was there ever a defensive briefing given to President Trump about the concerns you had about Mr. Papadopoulos, Carter Page, or anyone else, including General Flynn?
Not that I'm aware of.
Why?
Well, Senator, we typically don't provide defensive briefings when we feel that they could run the risk of compromising the investigations that we're undertaking. So before we provide a briefing, we try to determine whether or not that briefing will ultimately get communicated back to the target or somehow obstruct our ability to shed some light on whether or not there's actually a threat to national security.
So when it came to Papadopoulos, you never told the Trump campaign you may have a problem with him?
That's correct.
And when it comes to Carter Page, you never sat down with President Trump, we got concerns about Carter Page?
I do not believe that happened. Yeah. That's correct.
Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by saying that I heard, I think, my Democrat colleagues wondering aloud why it is that we're here today. And I have to say, I would have thought that would have been obvious by now, that we're here because we're looking at maybe the biggest scandal in the history of the FBI. We're looking at the use of the FBI to interfere in a presidential election. We're looking at the use of the FBI to lie to the FISA court, to so misrepresent facts, statements, and other material to this court that the court had to issue a statement saying that they could not trust the FBI, not only in this case, but in potentially every other case going forward. Absolutely unbelievable, unprecedented for a court to issue a rebuke of this nature. And I have to say, the fact that my Democrat colleagues wanted to shrug and move on in the face of this kind of interference, this kind of inappropriate behavior, this abuse of power, which is what it is really extraordinary. And of course, the individual we have before us today has an entire report written by the IG about how he lied repeatedly. And so that's why we're here. And by the way, now that we're in the middle of another election, the outcome of which is still disputed and unknown, and people are wondering, why is it that so many Americans don't have trust in the electoral process? This is why they don't have trust in the electoral process. This is why. It's because we've seen instance after instance of the abuse of the institutions of this country to try to interfere with the voice and the will of we the people. And we're looking at it today. That's what this is about. If anybody's has any question, that's what this is about. Now let's talk a little bit about that lying to the FISA court, which the FBI did repeatedly and DOJ signed off on. Mr. McCabe, let me come to you now. You know, I've had something of a personal quest here to try to find somebody who will take some responsibility for these warrants that they signed off on, for these applications that they personally signed off on. You signed off on a renewal application for the Carter Page FISA warrant on June 28, 2017. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Now, by January of 2017, the FBI had identified and interviewed Christopher Steele's primary subsource. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
And those interviews cast serious doubts on the accuracy of the Steele dossier, to put it mildly. Isn't that correct?
I know that now, yes.
The FISA renewal application that you signed, however, did not acknowledge any of those facts. Isn't that correct?
The FISA package that I signed contained the same contained the errors that are laid out in the IG report.
And by December of 2016, so this is months before the renewal application, the Crossfire Hurricane team knew that the primary subsource of the Steele dossier was suspected of being a Russian asset. Isn't that correct?
I don't believe that's correct. No, I don't know that to be the case.
Your testimony under oath is that the Crossfire Hurricane did not know that the primary subsource was potentially a Russian agent as of December 2016?
I can't tell you what the members of the team thought about the primary subsource in December of 2016. If you're referring to the recent footnote from the FISA report that was declassified by the Attorney General, but no, I don't know that they knew that then. I can't say what they knew.
The FISA application that you signed contained none of this, though, correct? It contained no new disclosures to the court. It contained none of the information that the FBI absolutely knew of. It contained nothing to give the court any pause about anything that you previously certified. Isn't that correct?
Well, I think you need to be, we should be specific about
No.
what.
Just answer my question. Did the application that you personally signed, did it disclose the interviews back from January of 2017 that you just said that you were aware of, that the FBI was aware of? The OIG report details this at pages 187, 188, and 189 of his report. You can go look it up. He's had a lot to say about you. You can go look up that IG report. They say that the FBI knew of the problems with this Christopher Steele's primary subsource and did not disclose it to the court. Isn't that correct? Yes or no?
The IG report, as my understanding, sir, details 17 errors that were present in the package that you're referring to.
Answer my question. Did the report that you personally signed, did it disclose the FBI's interviews in January of 2017? You signed the new application in June of 2017. Did it disclose the interviews casting serious doubt on the primary subsource? Yes or no? We both know the answer is no, but why don't you just say it? No, right?
It did not disclose serious concerns with the primary subsource.
Why didn't it? Why didn't you notify the court of this new information? Is it because you wanted to continue to undermine the election of Donald Trump? Let me ask you this. Didn't you send a text message on June 24, 2016 saying that I hope the Brexit vote doesn't predict a similar outcome here in November?
Okay, so I'd like to answer that. I'd like to answer your question, sir, but I'm going to need a little bit of space to get in a complete answer.
Why did you answer that question? Why did you send that text message?
I am, sir, as you know, I have not been able to review my text. I do not have my text in front of me here. I requested access to my materials, was denied that access. So I'm not prepared to answer your questions based on my text messages.
You don't recall them or you deny? Here's what it says, quote, I hope it, meaning the Brexit vote, doesn't predict a similar outcome here in November, end quote, June 24, 2016. Do you deny sending that message?
I don't know, sir. I haven't seen any of those text messages in over 4 years. And I'd like to be able to continue to, I'd like to give you a complete answer, but I'm having a hard time. When you speak over me, it cuts off my ability to respond.
Well, why don't you answer my question? Do you have no memory of that text message? Is that what you're saying of June 24, 2016?
Sir, I don't remember text messages I sent in 2016 that I haven't seen since then. So yes, I don't have a recollection of text messages from 4 years ago. That's correct.
Yeah, very convenient. I noticed that everybody who comes.
It would be much less convenient. It would have been really convenient to be able to review those materials before today.
Memory lapses, including you, Mr. McCabe. It's really extraordinary. Really extraordinary. Let me ask you about this text message. Peter Strzok sent this to Lisa Page on August 15, 2016. I want to believe the path that you threw out for consideration in Andy's office, that's you, that there's no way he gets elected, that's Trump. But I'm afraid we can't take that risk. I'd like an insurance policy in the unlikely event you die before you're 40. It's like an insurance policy in the unlikely event you die before you're 40. Why were you talking about the likely outcome of an election with two line agents who were working on a case, the Carter Page investigation at that time involving the president? Don't you think it's inappropriate?
I think the premise of your question is not accurate. I don't recollect ever talking to Peter Strzok or Lisa Page, only one of whom is an agent in the FBI, about the election or about that conversation that is referenced in their text message, which I was not a part of.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that that didn't happen? You deny that happened?
I don't recall that ever happening.
Just before we leave the FISA warrant application that you signed, the renewal application, how is it that the court was so deliberately and disastrously misled such that it had to issue a public rebuke at the FBI? Do you take responsibility?
I disagree with your characterization that the court was deliberately misled.
Oh, really?
That's correct.
Do you think it was just an accident?
I think that there were numerous and objectionable errors and omissions in that package, but
Do you
I
think
don't
that the falsification of an email, do you think the falsification of the email to the FISA court was an accident?
Senator, I am not aware of, Mr. Kleinsmith's activities I was not aware of until I read the IG report. I know that he has taken responsibility for those representations, and I understand that. The errors and omissions in that package, other than Mr. Kleinsmith's admitted activities over the report from the CIA, I do not know any of those other errors to have been proven to be intentional acts.
Senator.
Right. Okay, so we've established that.
Senator Hawley, your time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCabe, thank you for being with us today, listening to you, just answering Senator Hawley's question. It reminded me that you are spending a lot of your time on CNN these days, and of course, this is not a debate on CNN. This is a hearing of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And I have to say, when did you go to CNN?
I'm sorry, was that a question of when
I'll answer it for you. Was it in August? Was it in 2019? I think that may be right. I think you're pretty lucky.
It might be. I don't remember the exact dates.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact date, Senator, but that sounds about right.
Yeah, I think you're pretty lucky to have landed a job pretty much anywhere after having been fired from the FBI, and I think that the IG publicly flogging you in his report, and the AG fired you a month later, and that was a pretty sad demise, I guess, of your career in public service. And you were set to retire at the tender young age of 49. Isn't that correct?
No, ma'am.
Okay.
That's not correct.
What is correct?
FBI agents become eligible to retire when they reach age 50.
Okay. All right. And you've got a lawsuit against the federal government now claiming that you had a record of unblemished and nonpartisan public service, and you're demanding that the court reinstate your employment as Deputy Director of the FBI and pay you your full pension. Is that correct?
That sounds correct, ma'am, but I'll let the legal papers speak for themselves.
Let me ask you this. Listening to you today and having read some of the things around your career, how did you get caught up in such a web of deceit and obstruction and cover-up? And is this culture standard operating procedure at the FBI?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the point of your question, but I
The
also
point
don't
of my
agree with the
question is this. I'll
characterization of
help
the
you with
culture
it.
at the FBI.
Let me help you with that. You didn't want to answer Senator Cruz's questions about corruption, and I can understand why. But what you have to understand, that as overconfident as you all were in the plot that you were carrying out at the FBI, in your government job paid for by taxpayer dollars, you all had created this web and culture of corruption and cover-up and obstruction, and you thought that you could do it. You thought you would be able to get by with it, but you got caught. You've said today that you wish you could reconsider your decision requesting the FISA warrant on Carter Page and whether or not Director Comey should have held the press conference on Hillary Clinton. And listening to your answers, I think I have never heard of an action. Every criminal I have heard in a case, they generally will say they wish they hadn't committed the crime, or that someone who has done something wrong wishes they had not done that wrong. So you took these actions. You've been called out by the IG and the AG. Why shouldn't you be prosecuted for your actions?
Senator, first of all, there was absolutely no plot or scheme or conspiracy between myself or any of the folks that I worked with in the work that you've referred to, okay? Secondly, I'm not aware of a single, other than Mr. Kleinsmith's admissions, I am not aware of a single act or even an allegation against anyone who was involved in these cases.
Was the IG wrong?
Committed a crime.
Was the IG
I'd like
wrong?
to finish my answer, Senator.
Well, it's my time, and I've
I
only
am
got
not
2
aware of-
minutes left. How long have you known Christopher Steele?
I do not know Christopher Steele.
I think you've known him about 2 decades, right? How long has
No,
Bruce Orr known Christopher Steele?
To be clear, Senator, I don't know Christopher Steele. I've never met Christopher Steele, so that's not correct. And I can't tell you how long Bruce Orr has known Christopher Steele.
Okay. The exculpatory information on the Crossfire Hurricane, on Carter Page's recorded conversations, and that was not disclosed. What are the consequences under the FBI rules for when an FBI agent lies or otherwise misleads a federal court?
So the failure to disclose the Carter Page information is not as far as I'm aware, was not determined to be a deliberate misrepresentation to the court. So to answer your question about misrepresentations to the court, generally, FBI people would be disciplined in the same way anyone in the judicial system would if they were found to have deliberately and intentionally misled the court.
So you feel like no one did anything wrong?
I am simply following the findings of the Inspector General, which documented Mr. Kleinsmith's intentional acts, but failed to find any evidence, documentary or testimonial, to indicate that the other mistakes in the FISA package were the result of intentional misconduct.
Do you think you were wrongly fired?
Yes. Yes, I do think I was wrongly fired.
And
yes.
you think you did nothing wrong?
That's correct.
Even though the IG pointed out that you did, and even though you all had a culture of corruption and cover-up, that you thought it was okay to spy on Carter Page, it was okay to mislead Michael Flynn. This is a sad state of affairs, and I am pleased that you are no longer a part of the FBI.
Senator, I'd like to answer those allegations.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so no, I categorically refuse to agree with your assertions. No one that I am aware of in the FBI conducted any activity that should leave them susceptible to criminal prosecution, certainly including myself, as someone who's now been the subject of investigative activity for years, for no baseless, the subject of a baseless investigation conducted by U.S. Attorney's Office for almost 2 years, which concluded in a dismissal of their case. So no, I don't believe that I committed any crime. I know I never committed any crime working for the FBI. And yes, I believe that the conclusions in the IG's report were baseless. I believe it was a flawed and misleading and deeply unfair investigation that led to the my unfair termination.
Well,
Thank you.
if you know nothing about what was done, and Yates and Rosenstein and Comey all said they knew nothing about any of this, how in the world did it get so far off track? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. We'll go to Senator Kennedy next, but this is an important point. If somebody knew that the dossier was unreliable, do they have a duty to report to the system the information they found?
I think that's true. Yes.
Okay. Is it fair to fire somebody who knew and failed to report?
Well, it would depend, I guess, on the circumstances of where and how that happened. But
Well,
it
see, Mr.
certainly
Mc-
seems like that could be the result.
Yeah, Mr. McCabe, here's the problem. The problem is that by June of 2016, it was pretty clear that the dossier, was no longer reliable, that multiple stop signs had been run, that the CIA is suggesting that maybe Hillary Clinton signed off a plan to cook this whole thing up. She was defensively briefed, Trump never was, and the fact that this information was gathered in January and March, the stunning to now know that the subsource disavowed the document that was used to get a warrant, and nobody at the top had any idea that that occurred, is just earth-shatteringly disappointing. Do you understand how people could be disappointed in that?
I do understand how people could be disappointed in that, sir. I'm disappointed in it myself.
Yeah. And the point is, after a while, Mr. McCabe, it gets to be hard to reconcile all of this and come out and say that there was... Is it still your testimony that the Trump campaign and the Clinton campaign were equally treated when it came to allegations?
I think that the Trump campaign and the Clinton campaign were treated very differently in the context of two very different investigations.
Yeah, I'm just saying that it seems to me that allegations were made by both, and I'll sum that all up. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCabe, who is responsible for the misbehavior outlined by Inspector General Horowitz in his report about misfire hurricane?
Well, it depends on what you're referring to, Senator. If you're referring to the intentional misconduct committed by Mr. Kleinsmith, quite obviously Mr. Kleinsmith's responsible for that. I think from a command perspective, Director Comey and myself and our subordinate leaders are all responsible for the failures in that package that were allowed to go forward. But if you're asking me who is responsible for intentional misconduct beyond Mr. Kleinsmith's activity, I'm not aware that there's been a finding that others were engaged in intentional misconduct.
While you were either director or acting director of the FBI decided to investigate two presidential campaigns. One, Secretary Clinton, the other one, then candidate Trump, and later President Trump. I want to put aside Secretary Clinton for a second. When the FBI decided to investigate candidate Donald Trump, what questions did you ask? I mean, at some point somebody came to you and said, hey, Mr. Deputy Director, we're going to, just so you'll know, we're going to investigate the Republican nominee for President of the United States. You remember when you were told that?
So if you're referring to our initiation of the Crossfire investigation, so the investigation of the Trump campaign, I do remember conversations at the end of July 2016.
Okay, I'm not interested in the date. Excuse me for interrupting. I apologize. Would it be fair to say that the Christopher Steele dossier was the keystone of the investigation?
No, sir, that's not accurate.
Oh, well, how important was it? What word would you use?
It had no importance. We were not in possession of that information when we initiated the case.
Okay, so you're telling me when you initiated the case, Christopher Steele's dossier had nothing to do with your decision to go forward?
That's correct.
That's your testimony today, under oath?
It is.
Okay. At some point, the Christopher Steele dossier became important, did it not?
The Christopher Steele reporting came to us in the middle of September, and it became important to us at that time.
Okay. Now, when you heard about the Christopher Steele dossier, did you ask to interview Mr. Steele? I mean, you're only investigating a candidate for President of the United States. After you've already investigated one, now you're on the second one. Did you say, hey, I'm the deputy director here, I'm responsible. I want to talk to Christopher Steele. Did you do that?
I did not personally speak to Mr. Steele, but our investigative team traveled overseas.
Why not? You're the deputy. This is what I don't understand about this whole thing, Mr. McCabe. You're the deputy director of the FBI. And your people have decided to investigate the Republican nominee for President of the United States after already investigating the Democratic nominee. And at least in part, at some point, it was based on the Chris Steele dossier. Now, you can run from that one, but you can't hide from it. Did you ever call your guys in, or gals, and say, hey, just a thought, I think I'd like to talk to Chris Steele to see how credible this guy is, because you say you've never known him. Did you do that?
Senator, in my entire experience of 21 years as an FBI agent, I am not aware of a single instance of the deputy director of the FBI interviewing a source. And
well, how many nominees for President of the United States have you investigated?
I can't comment on that, sir.
Now, but you're telling me at no point you ever sat down and said, wait a minute, guys, this is now all based or substantially based on Chris Steele. I want to talk to this. I want to talk to this cowboy. You never did that.
That is not an accurate characterization of our investigation.
That's what you just said. You said you never talked to him. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth.
No, sir, I'm just trying to clarify that the Steele information didn't come to us until 2.5 months after we'd opened the case.
Well, when it came to you, did you say, wait a minute, guys, this is my reputation on the line. I want to talk to Christopher Steele.
No, Senator, I sent my investigators to conduct the investigation.
Okay. Do you know who? Do you know who Igor Danchenko is?
I do not.
You have no idea who that is, even today.
I am not going to speculate as to who he is.
Well, he was the subsource that the Steele dossier was based on. So Senator, you're telling, I want to be sure I understand. You're the assistant director of the FBI. You've decided to investigate the Trump campaign. You get this dossier, which, whether you admit it or not, was the basis for all the FISA warrants. You never sat down and said, I want to talk to Chris dossier, or Chris Steele. If you had talked to Chris Steele, you would have found out that his subsource was Igor Danchenko. That was his primary subsource. Danchenko was not, he wasn't from Russia. He was some guy in Washington, D.C. working for Brookings. He went to the University of Louisville. He went to Georgetown. He was buddies with Dr. Fiona Hill. He was relying on his drinking buddies. Why didn't all of you folks who are running this show say, wait a minute, this is all centered around Chris Steele. We better talk to Chris Steele, and we better talk to this guy, Danchenko.
Senator, it's important that I get this out. So if you could give me just a second.
Sure.
I am not sure that I have now read the report of the subsource interview, and the interviewee's name is still redacted in that report. So I do not feel comfortable acknowledging or confirming or denying any identity that might be associated with that person.
His own lawyers said it was him.
Here's what it looks like to the American people, Mr. McCabe. The FBI didn't even try here, the people making the decisions. You wanted to investigate Trump. I mean, this is a nominee for President of the United States. You've already investigated the other one and potentially screwed up her campaign. And so you get the Steele dossier. You don't sit down, you personally, and Comey, you don't talk to Chris Steele. You don't even ask questions about where he got his information. Had you done that, you would have found that he got it from Danchenko. Danchenko's a jellyhead. Okay, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And it all would have come apart. But you never looked. And it sort of looks like you didn't want to.
Is that a question?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So I can't possibly disagree more strongly with the way you framed that question. That while it is true that I never sat personally with Mr. Steele or any of his alleged sources, our team spent a great deal of effort interviewing him, interviewing other people that they thought were relevant, and trying to get to the bottom of the material that he provided. So no, we were not predisposed to investigating the president. It wasn't something we sought out to do, but we felt that the potential national security threat put us in a position where we were obligated to investigate. That's what we did.
And you expect American people to believe that?
That is the truth, and I certainly hope they believe it.
General Flynn's been prosecuted for lying to the FBI. You lied to the FBI, and you aren't being prosecuted. Don't you think that sends the wrong message to the American people?
Senator, General Flynn's situation and mine have absolutely nothing in common. I never, ever intentionally misled the FBI or the IG under any circumstances. And I think that's probably the conclusion that the DC U.S. Attorney's Office came to when they dismissed the 2-year investigation of me.
But you weren't fired for parking in the handicapped parking spot at the FBI, were you? You were fired for lying, were you not?
I was fired as the result of a deeply unfair and flawed IG investigation, and I am challenging that termination in federal court.
Okay. Last question. Do you have any idea, Mr. McCabe? I don't think Mr. Comey does. Do you have any idea how badly you and your colleagues have hurt the FBI? I mean, the premier law enforcement agency in all of human history. And it was just a handful of you. And now when the average American gets a knock on his or her door, FBI, I need to talk to you. At least half of them are thinking, oh my gosh, is the agent a Republican or a Democrat? They probably know my party affiliation. Do you have any idea how much damage you've done?
Sir, my colleagues and I never took any action to undermine our effectiveness, undermine our oath to this Constitution and the American people and the work that we did for the FBI. I deeply regret how politicized the FBI has become in light of the rhetoric and the relentless attacks levied upon it over the last 4 years. And I have great faith that my former colleagues will continue to do their work and ignore those sort of baseless attacks.
Well, at best, what you and Mr. Coleman and the others did, at worst, it was intentional. And I don't know what's in your head or your heart, but I can tell you what it looked like to the American people, at the very minimum. An incompetence tsunami. And they're thinking, how did these guys make it through the birth canal? Yeah. That's all I got, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Just to put a fine point on this, and we'll let you go, Ms. Cabe. Thank you for coming. Did you have regular meetings with the people in charge of Crossfire Hurricane?
We had regular meetings, we had impromptu meetings, or a lot of meetings.
You took it seriously, is that correct?
I think everybody took it seriously.
Okay. So was Peter Strzok your main source of information?
Peter Strzok was one of many sources of information. I met very regularly with Mr. Steinbach, Mr. Priestep, our general counsel, deputy general counsel. There were quite a few people involved at that level.
Did they tell you that the subsource was being interviewed in January?
I did know that the subsource had been interviewed. That's correct.
Did you ever ask the question, how did that interview go? Did it help us with a warrant application? Did it undermine the warrant application? Did you ask any questions about the results of the interview?
I did. I remember discussing it very briefly, and I was not informed of any concerns significant concerns with the things that the witness told them.
Yeah. Who did you talk to about the interview? Do you recall?
I do not recall, sir.
So you remember being told about were you told about the March interview?
No, sir.
So here's the question, I guess. If you ask them, how did the interview go? And nobody tells you that it basically destroyed the dossier, if that's not criminal, is it grossly negligent not to get that information to you?
I think that the case team should have had much more detailed conversation within themselves and also with the department attorneys who are writing the FISA.
Is the blame?
So, Senator, I think the information that they included in the FISA package about that interview, albeit wildly misleading, I think it reflects how they thought about the interview at that time. And I think they didn't think about it critically enough.
If you look at this interview and you're not wowed by how unreliable the dossier is, you don't want to see it as being unreliable. Now, you're in charge, the number 2 guy, of one of the most consequential investigations in the history of the FBI. It begins to fall apart. One stop sign after another is presented to the FBI. The CIA tells the FBI that this is internet rumor. You need to watch Christopher Steele. The State Department talks about him trying to take Trump down. Bruce Orr talks about you need to watch this guy. When the subsource is actually interviewed, he shreds the document as being reliable. And nothing seemed to work when it came to making sure that the true facts got out to the court and others. Nothing seemed to work. Can you give me an explanation as to why, when it came to the exculpatory part of this, nothing seemed to work the way it should?
Senator, I can only rely on the findings I've read in the IG report.
But you were the number 2 guy. You were in charge of all this. How is it possible that the number 2 guy in the FBI was not informed about these major breakdowns regarding the reliability of the dossier? Were you not informed about the email from the CIA saying, yeah, actually, Carter Page, he was a source for us?
Senator, I can't answer for you why I did not know something at the time.
Okay, well,
I can't comment on it.
Yeah, so that's the purpose of the hearing. The purpose of the hearing is to make sure that we find answers to how the system failed so it doesn't fail again. And I appreciate you coming. I'm sorry I didn't give you a break. And we will continue, in spite of my Democratic colleagues' protestations, we're going to find somebody accountable for something when it comes to Crossfire Hurricane. And thank you very much, Mr. McCabe, for participating in the hearing. I appreciate it very, very much and wish you the best.
Thank you.
All right, now as to why I'm doing what I'm doing. It's just astonishing to me that so much was ignored so often, and you come to the conclusion there is no there there. So what do we know? We know that no defensive briefing was given to President Trump about concerns regarding his campaign, but when there were concerns regarding the Clinton campaign and foreign influence, she was briefed. We know that Senator Feinstein was briefed when the FBI thought maybe a member of her staff was connected to the Chinese intelligence community. All of these investigations of the Trump campaign were counterintelligence investigations. Not one mentioned to President Trump, you may have a problem with Papadopoulos. Well, if you look at the transcripts of the bar talk with Mr. Papadopoulos, he says in the transcripts, he didn't even know he was being recorded, that no, he's not working with the Russians. He hasn't received any information from Russia. That would be treason. That would be a crime. The whole premise of Crossfire Hurricane was a report by a Australian ambassador to the United Kingdom that was given to somebody in our office in London. That makes its way back to Washington. They've got all this information where Papadopoulos denies working with Russians, and they just plow ahead. Compare that to the September CIA memo to the FBI suggesting that Hillary Clinton has signed off on a plan to link Trump to Russia to draw attention away from her email server problem. This is our CIA telling the FBI they have credible information, an investigative lead, that Hillary Clinton, the Democratic nominee, is trying to link Trump to Russia for political purposes, and the FBI completely ignored it. Apparently it threw it in the garbage can and considered an Australian ambassador meeting in a bar more reliable, didn't give it 1 minute of attention. And the reason that's important, it begins to explain how this all happened. Christopher Steele was on the payroll of Fusion GPS, who was on the payroll of the Democratic Party. Christopher Steele was working for the Democratic Party. He provided a dossier that used a Russian source who was suspected of being a Russian agent years before, and it turned out to be a bunch of garbage. So the reason the FBI should have looked at what the CIA had told them is it begins to make Crossfire Hurricane make more sense. That this whole thing was cooked up in July. That the whole idea of Trump-Russia connections were not real. They were manufactured in part by Christopher Steele. And the FBI bought it hook, line, and sinker. So I think a lot of us on our side are just astonished that when the CIA sends over information to the FBI, that they have intelligence that Hillary Clinton signed off on a plan to connect Trump to Russia to divert attention from her, that nobody at the FBI did a damn thing about it. Well, who did they send it to? Peter Strzok. Are you going to have me believe that Peter Strzok was fair-minded when it came to Trump Clinton? Doesn't it make a lot of sense that the person who hated Trump thought he should lose $100 million to nothing, thought he was an idiot, totally invested in making sure he never becomes president? Is it very far-fetched to say that when he got the information about Clinton, he just purposely did nothing with it? How do you explain a system this out of control? The most high-profile case maybe in the history of the FBI, at least near the top, that when the subsource is interviewed on 2 separate occasions and the information is damning to the dossier, it's exculpatory in nature, it never makes its way up to anybody who actually signed the warrant. What kind of oversight existed for this to happen? How serious were they about checks and balances? Why didn't they go to Trump and do for Trump what they did for Clinton? We think you may have a problem, you need to correct it. It's pretty obvious to us that Crossfire Hurricane started basically with a conversation in a bar. It took on a life well beyond what the evidence would require, that every time it was supposed to come to an end, it kept going. Every time they received some information that made the whole premise of the case unreliable, they ignored it. When it comes to General Flynn, in January the 4th, the professionals wanted to close out the case against General Flynn because there was no there. It was the 7th floor that kept it going. They tricked General Flynn into talking without a lawyer, without going to the White House. Sally Yates said they should have defensively briefed the president if they had a concern with General Flynn. They chose not to. They set him up and acted very dishonorably toward General Flynn. And there's nothing wrong with General Flynn talking to the ambassador of Russia when he's the incoming national security advisor. And the conversations are recorded, and there's not one word in there to suggest that General Flynn had been an agent of the Russians at any time. And they've basically tried to ruin the man's reputation. The professionals, January the 4th, took a hard look at General Flynn and found nothing there. It's just these people at the top who had an insane desire to keep looking at Trump people when the evidence would suggest they needed to stop. Why did they never stop when it came to Trump, when they should have stopped? Why did they never slow down? Because they had a bias. They really were in the tank when it came to Trump being a Russian agent. No matter what the evidence said, they were going after this guy because in their mind he wasn't worthy. Why did they not look at the allegations against candidate Clinton provided by the CIA? It would undercut the narrative. This wasn't an investigation that was unbiased. This was an investigation that was out of control. The people in charge of it were deeply biased. Their actions proved more than any direct evidence of their bias. Every time they had a moment to reflect, they moved forward. Every time exculpatory information was provided, they ignored it or altered it criminally. It's no accident to the American. It's no accident, in my view, that all this happened. This is not a series of random mistakes. This was a concerted effort to keep an investigation going that should have stopped, that should have slowed down. And what's the damage done? They manipulated the FISA court to keep a warrant process going that should have stopped months ago. They created a cloud over the FBI about political bias that lingers to this day. Lawyers are being prosecuted for manipulating evidence to keep a warrant application alive. They were told about information from the CIA that maybe this was all part of a political scheme of the opponent. They ignored it. They knew that the Christopher Steele dossier was suspect. They knew that the source was a prior suspected Russian agent, and they kept going and going and going. And they never at one moment gave President Trump a briefing that every other candidate should expect. If you think somebody in my office is doing something wrong, I would like for you to tell me so I can fix it. They weren't trying to protect Trump. They weren't trying to protect his campaign from foreign influence. They were trying to undercut the president. They were trying to keep an investigation going against a president, a candidate they despised. They had one standard for Trump, vastly different than that of candidate Clinton. And my Democratic colleagues say, let's move on. To this day, years later, I've yet to find one person who will take responsibility for manipulating the FISA court. I didn't know. If I knew then what I know now, I wouldn't have signed it. So who are we to blame? Is it somebody at the bottom of the pyramid who had all this exculpatory information and for some reason didn't share it? Is that what the system's come down to? Blaming somebody at the bottom? They take responsibility in name only. They don't seem to appreciate the gravity of damage done to the FBI and to the investigative process when they say, no, of course I wouldn't have signed that warrant. These are the people, Comey and McCabe, not Rosenstein and Yates, who are actually in charge of gathering the information. They're in charge of the investigative part of obtaining a FISA warrant. They gather the facts, and the lawyers at DOJ decide whether or not to pursue a warrant. The people in charge of this investigation were notified by the CIA that this may have been a plot cooked up by the Democratic candidate to blame Trump for being involved in Russia when he wasn't. They completely ignored it. And when they were hit hard by the facts that the dossier was a bunch of garbage, it just magically never made it up to their desk. Everything bad about Trump made it to their desk. Everything exculpatory about the Trump campaign never made it to their desk. How dumb do they think we are? This committee is not through. We're going to keep digging until we find out how the most high-profile investigation of a candidate for president of the United States and eventually a sitting president was handled so poorly, and try to let the FISA court know that we take our job seriously. So we will continue this process. People need to be fired, and I think the criminality here needs to be looked at. I find it very difficult to believe that this exculpatory information was not withheld from the court on purpose. We know Kleinsmith changed exculpatory information. We caught him. There's somebody else out there that probably knows. The system rejected the exculpatory information. They just didn't ignore it. To be continued. Thank you. Hearing is adjourned.